The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Marcus Thompson parked his car in the lot outside the municipal courthouse in Riverdale, North Carolina. The warm morning sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Marcus exhaled deeply. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness. But today, life had conspired against him. This wasn't supposed to be a complicated morning. The task ahead was mundane, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother left him. The city had raised the taxes inexplicably, and Marcus had spent weeks gathering proof that it was a mistake. The house was more than property to him. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong under his grandmother's watchful eye. Before we continue with Marcus's story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more compelling stories of justice and courage to light. Dressed in a dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt, Marcus looked every bit the seasoned attorney he was, even if his morning had been far from smooth. An urgent phone call about an ongoing human trafficking case had delayed him. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Marcus couldn't ignore it. He had reviewed the motion and provided feedback to his team before rushing to court, knowing he was cutting it close. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A quick glance showed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Judge in Riverdale has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Marcus sighed, tucking his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. But something in the message lingered. He shook it off as he stepped into the cool interior of the courthouse. The municipal court wasn't like the federal courts where Marcus spent most of his days. The walls were a dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and other small claims. Marcus checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare, barely enough time to find the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing people speaking in hushed tones. Room 204. Judge Richard Harrison was etched in brass on the door. Marcus adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling with people. Marcus found a spot near the back and sat down, flipping open his folder to review his evidence. As he scanned his notes, he noticed the judge entering the room. Judge Richard Harrison, a tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, commanded attention without saying a word. His reputation as a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he scanned the room, his sharp gaze missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room shuffled to its feet. Marcus joined in, his posture straight as the judge settled into his chair. Marcus noticed the stark silence that followed. Judge Harrison began calling cases one by one with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Marcus watched closely as a middle-aged man in a suit, arriving a few minutes late, shuffled into the room unnoticed. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes slipped in and took a seat. Neither received so much as a glance from the judge. Marcus made a mental note but focused on his own case. If you're finding this story engaging, remember to hit that subscribe button. There's much more to come in this tale of justice and accountability. Finally, at 9:15 a.m., Marcus heard his name called. He gathered his folder and made his way to the podium, projecting calm despite the slight delay. As he approached, Judge Harrison looked up, his expression hardening. Marcus felt the shift in the room, a quiet tension that hadn't been present for the previous cases. "You're late, Mr. Thompson," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Marcus raised his hand slightly, palms out in a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He maintained his composure, choosing his next words carefully. Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment. Judge Harrison waved a hand dismissively. We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hung in the air like a hammer striking an anvil. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Around him, murmurs rippled through the room. Your Honor, Marcus began, his tone calm and measured. May I explain? The judge raised his gavel, silencing him. You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court. Marcus stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness. It was about something deeper, something that many in the room had likely seen before. He glanced briefly at the other latecomers, none of whom had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring, and Marcus wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seat, Marcus opened his folder, but this time it wasn't the property tax documents he focused on. He began jotting notes, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The judge, meanwhile, continued with the next case, his voice unwavering. Marcus knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary morning, and what was about to unfold would shake the very foundations of justice in Riverdale. Marcus sat in the back row, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and observations. The courtroom proceeded in its rhythm, but Marcus couldn't shake the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. He replayed the moment Judge Harrison imposed the $750 fine, contrasting it with the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who had slipped in earlier sat near the front, scrolling on her phone, untouched by reprimand. A man in a gray blazer, now presenting his case, had clearly walked in after the judge began, yet the gavel's ire had been reserved solely for Marcus. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern Marcus could recognize as plainly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal instincts, assessing the situation with precision. A fine this steep for tardiness in municipal court was extreme, even punitive. He noted the expressions of those around him. A mix of disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity. Marcus could tell that others in the room were thinking the same thing, but no one dared to speak. Next case, Judge Harrison announced. Marcus's name echoed in the room again. He stood, his stride calm and deliberate as he returned to the podium. The judge fixed him with the same piercing gaze, as if daring him to falter. Marcus began, Your Honor, I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values. He placed the folder on the podium, opening it to reveal neatly organized documents and photographs. He gestured toward a specific page. This shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment, however, reflects a 30% increase without proper notification or explanation. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of disinterest. I'll review it in due time, Mr. Thompson. However, your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook. Do you truly believe that the urgency of your federal responsibilities justifies disrespecting this court? Marcus's composure remained intact. Your Honor, I mean no disrespect. My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree requires immediate attention. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone didn't waver. Your priorities, however noble, do not excuse breaking the rules. Court procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't the words themselves that struck Marcus. It was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't good enough. His professional achievements, his character, even his effort to respect the system, none of it mattered in this room. If you're finding this story as compelling as we do, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us continue sharing important narratives like this one. Marcus took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Your Honor, I understand the importance of rules. However, I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? A ripple of unease passed through the room. The judge stiffened, the color in his face deepening. Are you questioning the integrity of this court, Mr. Thompson? I'm asking for clarity, Marcus replied, his tone even. It's important to ensure that fairness is upheld, not just for myself, but for everyone here. The judge's gavel came down sharply. I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands. Marcus inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. He could sense the quiet admiration of some and the trepidation of others. This wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered bias cloaked in authority, but something about this moment felt different. The energy in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for what he would do next. Marcus pulled out his phone discreetly, typing notes. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. He made a quiet decision then and there. This situation wouldn't end here. The courtroom continued its routine, but Marcus's presence had already shifted the atmosphere. Others noticed it too. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Marcus a brief, knowing glance. The court clerk, her fingers flying over the keyboard, occasionally hesitated, her discomfort visible. When the session ended, Marcus lingered for a moment as people filed out. He observed the way they carried the unspoken weight of what had transpired. A young law student sitting in the corner scribbled furiously in her notebook, her expression one of awe and determination. Marcus left the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, his thoughts already forming a plan. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment or even the fine. This was about something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. As Marcus exited the courtroom, the crisp air outside offered no relief from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse buzzed with the mundane movements of everyday proceedings, but inside Marcus's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. No, he muttered to himself. Not yet. He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Harrison's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't incidental. It was structural. Marcus's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment. Back in his car, Marcus opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The federal prosecutor's emblem, embossed in gold, reflected the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He decided this would be the first move. By the time Marcus re-entered the courtroom, most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained, flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Harrison was leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly tired. Marcus walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification in hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk raised her eyes, her fingers pausing mid-type. Judge Harrison glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. Mr. Thompson, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment, the judge said curtly. With respect, Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice carrying a quiet authority. I believe it's important to formally introduce myself. He held his badge up slightly, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the room. I'm Marcus Thompson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of North Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. The judge froze, his hands stilling over the papers he was handling. The color drained from his face as Marcus's words registered. Around the room, the remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. I was late this morning because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention, Marcus continued, his tone firm but respectful. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Thompson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning, Marcus replied, holding up his notebook. Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. The next few weeks unleashed a storm of activity. The story moved faster than Marcus had anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. His supervisor, Victoria Chun, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, spoke with a mix of urgency and intrigue. Marcus, I read your report, she said. If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does, Marcus replied. What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Victoria exhaled sharply. I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready. If you're finding this story as powerful as we believe it is, please take a moment to subscribe. Stories like these need to be shared. The investigation that followed was meticulous and far-reaching. Marcus spent hours piecing together every detail from the municipal court session. He combed through public records, noting inconsistencies in fines and penalties issued by Judge Harrison. Patterns began to emerge. Fines for minor infractions were significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. Marcus reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories of desperate treatment flooded in. Some whispered in confidence. Others offered with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses received only a small fee. Another described how the judge often interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators descended on the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Elizabeth Reynolds, proved to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. These are notes I've been taking, she confessed. Every time something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore. The notes painted a damning picture. Dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment were meticulously recorded. Investigators also spoke with Michael Carter, the longtime bailiff in the courtroom. He shared his observations with quiet conviction. I've been here 15 years, Carter said. I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do. The mounting pressure began to take its toll on Judge Harrison. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately he began to realize the gravity of the situation. By the end of the first week, Marcus received a call from Victoria. The findings so far are staggering, she said. The numbers don't lie, Marcus. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. It's systemic. The story had spread far beyond Riverdale. National media outlets picked up the case. Headlines like, "Systemic Bias Unveiled," "Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand," dominated the news cycle. Social media hashtags such as #EqualJusticeNow and #BiasInTheCourts trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. 3 months after the morning that set everything in motion, the courthouse in Riverdale looked markedly different. The tired beige walls were repainted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors as they entered. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they hadn't known were available before: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. A small but meaningful plaque had been installed near the entrance, Equal justice is everyone's right. Judge Harrison resigned, and in his place, a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality had taken over. More importantly, systemic reforms were already underway. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training led by experts who tackled the subtle ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Marcus's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Marcus thought for a moment before responding. "Listen to each other, to the people who come through our courts, and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." Thank you for joining us for this powerful story of justice and transformation. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring narratives that shed light on important issues in our society.